Wow, what a crowd. This looks wonderful out here. It's a really good evening. I'm Bill McDowell. I'm the chair of the Center of Architecture for the Louis Kahn Memorial Committee. And I'm pleased to welcome you to the 33rd Annual Louis Kahn Memorial Talk. The Center for Architecture is proud to continue his remembrance of the rich legacy of the educational and architectural leadership of Louis Kahn. His work and teaching had an enormous impact on generations of architects and continues to this day. We're thrilled to honor his legacy tonight with a talk by Sir David Adjaye, one of the world's leading architects and innovative thinkers. Thank you, David, for accepting our invitation. I'd like to thank our sponsors. This event would not be possible without the generous contributions made by the companies listed behind me, many of whom have supported this Kahn Memorial Lecture for numerous years. These organizations believe in the importance of good design and the improved quality of our built environment. Thank you very much. I'd like to specifically mention our presenting sponsor this year, Steve Gendler, who is the co-founder of MIS Capital, along with David Coleman. MIS is a development company whose mission is to develop financially successful projects in an environmentally sustainable way, most importantly, contributing to the quality of life for the communities in which those developments take place. Steve is on the board of the Center of Architecture and continues to make significant contributions to its mission. Thank you, Steve. Could you please stand? Our SALT level sponsor is Liberty Property Trust, our longest sponsor in the history of this event. And when I say Liberty, I would like to specifically acknowledge John Gattuso, a leading member of Philadelphia's development community. Thank you for your continuing support, John. Our Richards level sponsors, Our Richards level sponsors, Clemens Construction, Knoll, Powell Trackman, thanks to Steve Poppert, Frank McGuire, and Rich Davies. And finally, our Esherick level sponsors, Aileen and Brian Roberts, Langan, L.F. Driscoll, and the Neubauer Family Foundation. And a big thank you to all the staff and volunteers that make this event happen. Thank you, guys. This event benefits the Charter High School for Architecture and Design, founded in 1999 as a legacy project of the American Institute of Architects Philadelphia chapter. CHAD is a Philadelphia public charter school that utilizes principles of design thinking to engage students. All students take design classes at every grade level. CHAD encourages creative thinking in core subjects as well as design. CHAD was started by the AIA to introduce awareness of the various design professions at an early age. It also set out to introduce potential career paths to an inner city population that is often unaware of these opportunities in typical public schools. CHAD is one of the city's most unique schools, and today enrolls 600 students from nearly all zip codes in Philadelphia. CHAD offers 4 majors in architecture, fashion design, industrial design, and graphic design. 75% free, an indicator of our poverty rate. 65% of students go on to 4-year colleges, significantly higher than the city average. Students accepted in the design programs at colleges such as RISD, Savannah College of Design, California College of Art, Moore, and Philadelphia University. If I could ask Greg Wright and the students and teachers from CHAD to stand up. Thank you. You're the next generation. I have one more special acknowledgement tonight. Someone who had a very special connection with Louis Kahn. I would like to recognize Henry Wilcox, who spent over 20 years helping Louis Kahn build the Bangladesh Capitol Complex in Dhaka. Henry is 90 years old and is here tonight. As described in a recent Philadelphia Inquirer article, in 1963, Kahn knocked on Wilcox's hotel room door in Dhaka, where Henry was working as an architect, to borrow some gin to brush his teeth. As with most expats, due to the local water, Henry had plenty. That chance meeting led to a friendship, and soon thereafter, Henry joined Kahn's firm to work on the Bangladesh project. After Kahn's death in 1974, Henry moved to Bangladesh and spent the next 10 years working on completing the vision of Louis Kahn. It is a privilege to have Henry here tonight, and if I could please ask you to stand up, Henry, I'd like to give you a round of applause. And now, to make the introduction of our honoree tonight, I would like to introduce Laurie Olin. Laurie is an internationally known landscape architect, currently working on the designs of both Google and Apple office complexes, as well as other projects around the world. He's a practitioner, a teacher, a writer, a prolific sketcher, and he has collaborated with our honoree tonight. We are proud to have him come to the stage and make the introduction. Laurie, please come on up. And thank you all very much for coming tonight.
Hi, and good evening. It is really a great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. As you know, he's an internationally known and important architect, one appropriately worthy of delivering a presentation that also honors one of Philadelphia's greatest internationally known architects, Louis Kahn. For the past 40 years or more, I've had the personal pleasure and professional privilege to work in very close collaboration with a number of talented leading architects in this country and abroad, and to observe them up close and to study their work and their insights and their ideas. My luck continues in that a couple of years ago, I was fortunate enough to have David Adjaye invite me to join him on a competition. It was great fun, in the course of which I watched him develop two completely different superb schemes for two separate locations. I was impressed by his quickness, his sharp critical eye, and his deep humanity. As it turned out, we were probably both very fortunate not to win, as the project has gone off in a direction in no way resembling the remarkable social and environmental vision of David's that I had witnessed, which was much more radical in its proposed profound engagement of the community than the sponsor was capable of. I learned a lot about him and his work in the course of that, and his approach to collaborative spirit, which has led to our working together again, which has been truly a great privilege. Now, to the American public and to some of my colleagues, this remarkable person seemed to have suddenly appeared a few years ago like a meteor coming from who knows where, when his design was selected as the winner for the competition of the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the National Mall in Washington. In fact, however, he'd already accomplished a remarkable amount of superb and at times provocative, very public work from the moment he was finishing his student days in London. Sir David Adjaye is a citizen of our time and of the world who, although born of Ghanaian parents in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, had already lived in Tanzania, Egypt, Yemen, and Lebanon by the time he had arrived in London at age 9. A British citizen, he went on to receive degrees from both the London South Bank University and the Royal College of Art. He received a medal from the RIBA just as he was leaving school. And where am I here? Yes, just as he really, and also he went on to teach again right away at the Royal College of Art and at the AA, his alma, in the Architecture Association on Grosvenor Square. His initial introduction to professional practice found him carefully observing. I think he was very carefully studying the studios of David Chipperfield and Eduardo Sotomayor before he quickly opened his own office and participated in the ferment of London's architectural scene of the 1990s and the early years of this millennia, especially in the East End around the Whitechapel Gallery, the Tate Modern, and the nexus of personalities associated with art, with fashion, with design, and with the media. And he produced a series of projects and houses for prominent artists and designers, a number of which appear in his first book, David Adjaye Houses. I don't know how many of you here were fortunate or able to see the exhibition Making Place, the architecture of David Adjaye at the Art Institute in Chicago 2 years ago. But if so, you would have learned of his remarkable interest in craft, of his interest and personal study, his research and his reflection on materials, often extremely humble and common materials, and in the making of things, of the relationship between simple combinations of elements and shapes, and the resultant structures that can be at once both richly decorative and space-making. Like all real artists, David is seriously interested in form and its potential to provide meaning as well as utility, something we think of when we think of Lou Kahn. There has been in his work a trajectory of formal exploration that is as personal as it appears universal, the sort of journey that we associate with the most reflective of practitioners. Starting in London, David has since produced thoughtful and well-received projects in many parts of the world. From time to time, people ask me, how can you work successfully in different cultures with their different histories, their climate, and ecology? Well, looking at David and his work is to answer that question. Only by navigating between two poles. One is to hold true to deep personal feelings and interests that afford artistic coherence and a point of view, and the other is to embrace an abiding concern for eternal and universal issues that have engaged societies and designers since antiquity. These are things related to light, to shelter, to form, to techniques, and to place. The first building of David's I ever experienced was MCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver, that he completed 11 years ago. It's a Kunsthal in the best sense, one with an effective and diverse collection of handsomely lit spaces. It's made very simply, but elegantly, of concrete. It's a calm, rather contextual building, taking its place on a street in the downtown of an American city as a good neighbor, only to surprise and delight one immediately upon entering, where it turns out to be much more complex than it's expected, and a superb place to exhibit and experience contemporary art. Here, I felt, was real architecture without an excess machinery or huffing and puffing. His brilliant, and for some in our nation, an appropriately challenging National Museum of African American History and Culture is probably his best-known project. Its strength, clarity, color, form, and texture purposefully make the case that this building is not more neoclassical building business as usual, but something to consider not only as different, but importantly so. The decision to provide contrast, even to the point of being somewhat confrontational, rather than quietly blend in, speaks to powerful and necessary messages that are presented so eloquently within about the continuing struggle of people of color and those who seek freedom and equity. If he were never to do anything else, he's done this. But there is more, much more. Prior to the museum, David had designed two other brilliant works in our nation's capital. These are two community libraries in different African American communities that have become cultural centers, magnets for children and adults alike, that are as colorful and lively as works of architecture as they are shrewd in their use of materials, resources, and spatial clarity. Beyond these local examples, he has, as you may be aware, produced significant work in Britain, Spain, Norway, Russia, and elsewhere, with projects currently underway in Harlem, in Georgetown, in London, and in Ghana. Although currently taking a break from teaching at the moment, in part because of the press of work requiring an excruciating amount of travel, and in part because he's a family man with two gorgeous small children, the youngest being only 2 months of age. But again, like Lou Kahn and a handful of others, he has been a teacher, practitioner, and until recently has taught almost since graduation from college, as mentioned earlier in London, later at Harvard and Princeton, and here as the Louis Kahn Visiting Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. For all of this energy, activity, and true artistic accomplishment, David Adjaye has received numerous prizes and awards, including just last year, the highest honor possible for a person in the arts in Britain, namely in having been knighted by the Queen. Please join me in welcoming Sir David Adjaye to the podium.
Thank you so much for those kind words, Laurie. It's very hard to, I always kind of double take when I hear people talk about me. Forgive me. Thank you for this incredible honor. I mean, Lou Kahn is, for me, one of the kind of giants of the 20th century and really one of the lights that leads us into the 21st century. I think his path and his ability to to synthesize what Laurie said, the kind of eternal components of architecture into different places, has always been a huge inspiration for me. It's wonderful to hear that you, the architect of Dakar's project, I took my students to Dakar, and we climbed all over that building. We went up into the domes, into the roofs, and it was the most moving thing for me and my students, so I'm incredibly honored that you're here. I wanted to talk to you about 5 projects, which are different typologies, some very modest, and then end on the Smithsonian, and to try and maybe chart the way my thinking works and my strategies for different projects in different contexts. I'm going to start with a very small project in Gwangju. Gwangju is in South Korea. And it was a kind of a wonderful invitation to be part of a biennial that happens in that part of the world every 2 years. And Gwangju is extraordinary because it's a city where the biennial creates a relationship with artists. So an architect and an artist join together as a sort of pair, and they are given the city. And the city sort of allows the team to find an opportunity to make something. And there's no brief given. And it's one of those wonderful sort of moments in architecture where you are just allowed to be without the kind of specificity of a brief. And it's a very kind of powerful arena. What happens is that the building is not, you're not even given a specific park to put it in. You can challenge the city to put it almost anywhere you want. And then a budget is found for your project. It has to be some kind of modest project, of course. And then it's built and it's permanent. So the city, for the last, I think 50 years, has accrued an extraordinary body of beautiful pavilions all over its context, which have enriched the quality of the city and its citizens. So my partner at that time was an incredible dear friend and colleague of mine, Adjaye Associates, an incredible writer who has sort of emerged as really a very powerful voice speaking about the diaspora and the context of West Africa and the West. And she's somebody that I wanted to work with because in a way there's something about Gwangju that was compelling for me, that it is a city of literature. Their revolution was came from a literary sort of background. And there's a kind of culture of an extraordinary sort of reverence for books and for the printed matter, even to this day. And I found that extraordinarily striking, and we felt that we wanted to somehow work somehow with this notion and to see if we could come up with a project that would honor that extraordinary social context, but also see if we could make another form to add to the city. We wandered around the city for hours and days, and we eventually sort of ended up on this. And we asked questions about this structure. This is an existing sort of, you can see a kind of hyper-modern city with all its infrastructure, and a water body which has been heavily sort of landscaped and kind of created as a kind of a wonderful aspect for the city and the citizens to be able to go right to the waterfront and to enjoy it as their park, almost their kind of powerful bucolic space. And the city creates these extraordinary sort of structures, these sort of precast, concrete, metalwork structures that take you from the upper level of the city down to these water points. And there's a kind of budget for that every time. And then somehow the sort of cultural part of the city also then puts up a pavilion sort of next to these things to kind of create them as a kind of beautiful overlook, sort of reminding people of sort of the paintings in Korea and tea houses, etc. And I was very taken by that in this sort of extraordinary context, and felt with Ty that we would want to see if we could translate, raid this budget, so raid the budget for doing one of these, and see if we could remake it as a new kind of form and move it away from the sort of infrastructure team in the city and see if we could bring architecture to it. We found a site that was due to be built. They'd already put the cultural objects sort of there, but they hadn't built the infrastructure bridge, so we took that budget and proposed what we're calling a library without walls. So we created a form that we felt would basically create a gathering point by this water body that would honor this idea of books, which you find, you go to street benches and you find beautifully folded newspapers and books just laying next to you, and the idea is that you read it and you leave it for somebody else. You don't throw it in the bin. That it's continually cycled. And we felt that we wanted to make this open library a sort of space that would be recognized in this community as a place where you could deposit books. And the initial start for the project was that Adjaye would select 200 books from around the world, including also some from Korea, that would start the library. And we got the local library to be involved in managing the space. It's a sort of Wi-Fi space, and we basically essentially turned the staircase that you need to take down to the waterfront into the library structure. The sketches for it really played with the two kind of fundamentals. One is that the site can flood up to 2 meters in sort of different water tables, so it had to be precast up to that street level, and that was a specific thing. And the upper level form could be whatever we needed it to be, and I chose timber in reference to that idea of that Korean timber pavilion, and to sort of join the two in a sort of union to create a sort of new form that maybe starts to celebrate this new junction that we were trying to make, which was more than just a stair, but a place in this context. A lot of effort was made to kind of create as much of a sort of stage that would kind of face as many directions as possible, and then the structure above it would sort of create the divisions, the walls that would support it. I wanted to do some very simple things. The lower section has sort of cast in it slots for all the books. And it's sort of made as a kind of random landscape. And then the upper level is really a way in which the timber structure is using a very simple technique of repeating a motif, but taking it through a sort of vector, a study, a sort of geometry, whereby you just adjust the length of each piece of timber cut. You don't try and dress it, and you enjoy the imperfection that comes from it. And that creates, I wanted to create in this instance a crossvault, which was a kind of, for me, a form that kind of really points to a kind of a rest point, a stopping point. So the plan really is this form here. The balcony comes above, and you go down the stairs, and you go down in 2 ways, and then these 4 columns with the books in it, and then the timber structure which rises above, and finally completes in this geometry, which is this interlocking system of the roof. This is the building in its context. You can see the waterfront, and that's the building in its context next to this very important housing sort of neighborhood. And, what's kind of amazing is that in this context, this is a Korean bridge, which would never pass any code in any place that we know. But this is actually, people are encouraged to use this. Children, adults, pushing your bike over it, there would be a sort of lawsuit sort of on this. But really, it's sort of, kind of an extraordinary thing, really. Then, in a way, the pavilion really sort of marks this kind of bridge's end and this sort of walking path, and becomes this kind of moment in the fields where it sort of, I stained it with a sort of dark sort of preservative that sort of allows the timber to last for as long as possible, and then stained the concrete with a black stain to sort of unify it, but then to let light sort of reveal its texture and its patina. You can see the old structure there. We kept it. They said, do you want to take it away? And I said, no, I wanted to keep it and have this kind of sort of reference to the 2 systems. And then you can see how this new sort of piloted form comes in. And as I said, this can flood. So this building, in certain kind of conditions, which happen maybe every 50 years or 20 years, will flood. And this form will be sort of submerged temporarily. And then the form of the library, and this is a real photograph where the books are just kept, and it's a sort of Wi-Fi zone. There are talks that happen here, DJs play music here, there are parties that now happen under this form, and it's just this space where this incredible sort of civility about literature and about the idea of sharing was just so powerful to me that I just wanted to create this this architecture for it. So Taye sort of started it with the 200 books, and it's now grown. And the books are still there. The library people sort of keep an eye on it regularly. And these are sort of Instagram photographs of we get pictures from people all the time. What's the wonderful thing about social media? You can sort of keep an eye on your projects without actually going to see them. Sort of events. The mayor uses it now for kind of big talks. So this is the mayor talking about some issue that was used the structure as a kind of as a sort of form. And then just looking at the detail, this idea of the imperfection of joinery, but the sort of a new sort of way of looking at the sort of way in which the ornamentation of that imperfection creates these kind of variables and these differences that are just through simply the different cuttings of the timber. It becomes quite dramatic. This is just before the books were put in, just when we were finishing the construction. Sort of almost as a kind of, for me also, this kind of romance of it being almost like a sort of ruin also was very powerful, that it has this kind of almost sort of quality of almost having always been here and not something to do with necessarily now. And then the sense that the sort of materiality, as you're kind of under it, kind of reveals these different textures and light qualities as you're in it. As you were from above, it's absolutely compressed, so you really come in and it's compressed. There's one Juliet seat for reading and sort of enjoying the cross view, which has this kind of panoptic sort of privileged view underneath the dome, and then you go down. And then this is the overview of the building and its sort of its inspiration in the same context. I'm going to move on to a second project that Laurie spoke about, two libraries that we did in DC, which we won almost at the same time that we won the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And we were making these buildings whilst we were working on the museum. And I really wanted to work on these two buildings with, the library services were quite shocked that we came to pitch for these projects. They're very modest, sort of very low budget projects. And I really wanted to use the experience of making that library as a way to understand the communities outside of the center of DC, but also to have a sort of practice that was already working in DC, working not just on this kind of extraordinary national monument, but also at the sort of social, sort of everyday moment of a kind of neighborhood, a suburb in the city, sort of also kind of having sort of high, as much design thought within the budget that we were given. So it's the two libraries are in Southeast and Southwest. The kind of beautiful sort of neighborhoods in these areas are, for me, extraordinary because the suburbs are kind of interlaced with these kind of fantastic pieces of landscape that are real pieces of forest. They're not manicured parks that are sort of cut, that the communities cut into. But also there's a kind of extraordinary topography in these areas that, in particular, William Lockridge was sort of typified, and that was something that I really enjoyed. In the two libraries, it was the same program. I'm not going to show both, I'm going to show one, but in a way the same program at the same time, given for two sites. And I was very interested in how to work in these two different contexts, one really at the edge of a forest, the other on this sort of, in the suburban area on this sort of hill. And to think about how one could make two different forms with the same sort of brief and projects that are not too far from each other. And of course, the history of libraries we know, but the history of academic libraries are really well known. But really, the history of post-war sort of suburban rollout libraries are really these sort of boxes which had the kind of kind of required amount of books to kind of create the knowledge base. This is sort of the internet of the day, I guess. And it would be the kind of place where, you'd go to get the Encyclopedia Britannica, etc. And what has happened, I think, within communities is that these spaces have kind of incubated and created a certain sort of sense of a sort of, for us, a community space that is very essential now in the urban fabric, even though some people might argue that the internet has kind of shifted that. What has happened, I think, when we make architecture, no matter how modest, and it becomes part of the ritual of our cities, I think that they take on a kind of quality that we absorb that starts to kind of create other bonds that are beyond necessarily the program brief, and I've become very fascinated with that. So in talking about the libraries, we talked about them as being more than just receptacles for books, but they were places for the community to come together, and they were places that had to perform as much as possible to enhance the civic life of the community. The libraries that were done by the DC Public Library were sort of extraordinary. They rebuilt the entire program, which I think is one of the kind of exemplar sort of programs for redoing that. These are the two libraries that I did, and I'm going to just quickly talk about this one. This is the neighborhood that I was talking about, which is a very typical sort of inner city neighborhood. With these sort of very simple turn of the century inspired sort of semi-detached houses and some of the sort of later post-war sort of apartment buildings. And this idea of kind of negotiating sort of things I want you to pay attention to, negotiating kind of propping, sort of looking at volumes that are up above, sort of the way in which volumes and sort of juxtapositions are being made from these primary volumes was something that I became very fascinated with. And in a way, I wanted to read in this project a way of reading the context that was very familiar to everyone in a new way, and to use the same aggregation and system, but in a new sort of a manner. So this is sort of the plan, and the houses that we're talking about are sort of here. This is sort of a retail space, and this is the sort of the buildings with the stilts that I was talking about here. This is the library, and I felt that I wanted to make a sort of an agglomeration building, a building that would agglomerate with almost the same kinds of geometry, but deform. The geometries would deform to kind of deal with different aspects and different views, and each one would have a unique program. So the main body of the library in the center, and then a series of 3 volumes, one for children, one for teenagers, one for adults, would articulate the sort of sense of the building and its relationship to its context. So in a way, sort of instead of having a traditional sense of 4 facades, there are 12 facades essentially, or slightly more, on this building. So this idea of kind of making a multiple set of systems that kind of deals with the kind of the complexity of the site was what was fascinating for me. So this exploration of then what is the heart of this, how does this building perform, sort of, it had to be efficient in terms of its footprint, etc., for the cost, but also how does it kind of create generosity by compressing itself? How does it also create generosity to allow other things to happen? And in a way, some of the kind of explorations were really tested here. So really this idea of compressing very much, but then making these incredible open spaces. This is a southern elevation. So we used 2 pavilions to create a sort of large porte cochere, which is like an auditorium, before you get into the main house of the building, and then really use the sort of back of the building where it's closest to the suburban gardens as a way to create a relationship between the library itself and its context. And then sort of allowed these very special rooms to be made in these pavilions that surround it, which are different to the slab sort of spaces of the main body. So in each sort of sequence, from just entering through to coming into the main hall, through the different floors and its aspects, through to kind of moments in the pavilion, each moment sort of somehow lifting and sort of hopefully edifying the experience of being in this building. And I love sort of this plan, working on this plan for me was about trying to kind of almost dissolve where the building begins and where the sort of street edge sort of ends. So this idea of bringing the pavement right into the site and using the sort of volumes as shading devices, but also devices to announce the entry into the main hall, lecture hall, sort of community meeting room, a giant stair that takes you up, sort of staff behind, up into different sort of spaces. This is a kind of light well that sort of divides a sort of, sorry, this is the ground floor, so just a kind of larger version of that plan. Sort of a light well in the center, coming up the stairs, another light well that kind of takes you up the stairs, and then in a way using these light wells and these devices to create these other rooms that start to kind of frame other experiences, places to kind of retreat, be able to have kind of vignettes and views, and then sort of reading stacks and places. This is a children's reading area, and storytelling area, and a toddler's sort of storytelling pavilion and sleeping pavilion just right here. And then as you go up, you come into adult stacks and a teaching, sort of reading hall, which is at the end of this sort of light well, a teenage sort of library, and then a sort of business center, which has meeting rooms and sort of special personal spaces, and a kind of very sort of large bar to look over the context of the city. This is the building in its context. So it's sort of, in a way, this idea of the kind of aggregation of these forms and this sort of informality of the architecture, but sort of elevating it up to this sort of public building. You see here that sort of, in a way, the timber became for me a way to acknowledge the kind of richness of this sort of incredible landscape that is all around these neighborhoods that are so lush, but to kind of make a kind of compression of that as a way to kind of organize these deforming geometries which are based off the same family. And then, in a way, the southern elevation, this space becomes a gathering space for students, and it has sort of steps set out, so it's a sort of auditorium for students, but it's also a place where now car boot, there's a kind of a whole thing of car boot sort of barbecues and sales, etc. And that all happens now in front of the library in this neighborhood. It's sort of, people park up, and events are happening in the library even when it's closed. And then as you sort of rotate around the form, this idea of the sort of 12 elevations of this form, always continually shifting and changing your relationship to it. And even when you're right next to it, this idea of the pavement coming right in, but not knowing whether you're inside or outside is very important. So this idea that somehow the undercroft feels like the interior, that it has the same kind of pleasure, it's not exterior somehow. And that when you come closer, the materiality also kind of, for me, blurs this notion of inside-outside and also repeats motifs that you will see inside, the idea of slots of light that kind of fall in. And then when you enter into the space, the main hall, and then the sort of main stair, which takes you up, the light slot that divides the sort of children's areas and certain kind of sort of lecture spaces, quiet spaces from the loud spaces. And then as you rise up into the main sort of level, you sort of come into this main hall and you look up into the upper light well that sort of shows you the adults kind of working, the children are on this here, and the sort of stacks behind the light slot, which is in this space, looking out towards the neighbors. So these are these moments that are one of those kind of niche moments where you have an ability to kind of get a magazine or books and read, and you're looking into the gardens and looking across the entire site, but you're sort of in these kind of layers and folds of space. Or you're in, the sort of children's side where you've just come across from that side into this side through the light well. The light is sort of pulsing in between, so there's always the presence of light. But then you have all these different kind of conditions in what seems like a very straightforward sort of horizontal plate. And then this is the storytelling pavilion for the children, which has a sort of reverse pyramid to kind of lower the scale of the space and kind of allows. The toddlers can be laid out in blankets, which they're laid out and sort of allowed to roam on the floor. And then just coming sort of next to that form, rising up to the upper spaces where you have the same incline as the incline of the landscape. This is the same incline as the site, and then you go to the upper level where you have sort of teaching labs and next to the two light wells. Just sort of a close-up of that, and that's the way in which that's sort of looking through the spaces. And then into the teenager space with its kind of large bay window to the community in the context. So it has this kind of extraordinary sort of privileged moment where you're in the treetops, sort of, but looking over the community, and then coming through to the adult space, which then has this extraordinary bar for working at, where you can just come and just work and overlook the neighborhood. So in a way, the building is trying to sort of maximize all the kind of informality that happens from the context, but also try to kind of create a sort of moment of small magic out of the sort of modest means that we have. And so this is just rotating around. This is the grand stair that I was just talking about. And then the volumes as they kind of form round. And then the sort of large window with the reading spaces that overlook the sort of gardens to the neighborhoods. So I'm going to move from that to Sugar Hill. Sugar Hill is a project that we did in New York. It's my first big project in New York, and it was very important to me, this competition. It sort of came at the right time. It was the first large project, and it was at a time when a lot of sort of big-name architects were doing very high-end, luxurious housing. This project came along from this incredible community called the Broadway Housing community, and it was for a new housing scheme to deal with the constituents that they have, which are homeless people. So essentially, it's a homeless housing urban block for the city. And what was wonderful is that they, as a sort of charity, were able to get a patron to buy an extraordinary site who wanted to be nameless, to buy an extraordinary site on 155th and St. Nicholas Ave in Upper Harlem, and then they were able to amass tax credits and other sort of fundraising strategies to allow us to make this building. It was a competition that we won. And really, for me, what was interesting was that it was really, for me, a way to address the way in which the sort of architecture of the poor, as you know, I mean, Moses was particularly bad in New York, but you know, this idea of a kind of an apartheid architecture where the sort of infrastructure kind of makes the kind of fortress wall, and then sort of incubates the community away from the city, is a sort of typical apartheid strategy that it's very sad to have seen happen in New York. And in a way, what I loved about this project was this idea that somehow it could, the client, this was for the lowest demographic, you know, the homeless from the streets, but we wanted to have it in the city, and we wanted the building to challenge this idea of poor architecture always being kind of ghettoized and being problematic, but being something that would contribute to that neighborhood and create a new community hub. Again, very low. The budget of the buildings were no more than a little bit over what this architecture kind of allows, but we pushed as much as possible. You know, what was interesting was that in that time, looking at the studies that we were looking at, you know, homelessness was rising, had been rising from 1990 to 2013. It's now stabilizing, but it's actually, you know, New York is not famous for seeing lots of homeless people on the streets, but actually it has a kind of serious problem of homelessness. And it's something that I felt I really wanted to engage with. This is Broadway Housing. Ellen Baxter, an extraordinary visionary who really heads this organization, was moved by this issue, bought buildings with the help of her patrons. One of her first housing sort of buildings for the homeless is here on the west side of the city, right near the river. And this was her first new building, and you know, the ambition was very high to do the best we can within the budget that we could. But also, you know, what we pushed was that we really wanted a project, and our clients were completely aligned with us, that hit the ground and offered something different to the ground, so that the ground was not just housing, but was an activated ground plane to try and create what we were talking about. This is that same area, Harlem. This is sort of New Harlem, and it's sort of amazing that only 150 years ago this was farmlands, and you know, you'd move from the sort of slum and sweat of the city, and this is where you would be just by going uptown. And this is what it is, you know, in the sort of now, just before, and these are images just before we built our building. This is 155th and St. Nicholas Ave, just up here. This is a car park that was on the site that apparently Duke Ellington used to park his car in. We were told, we took it. It was a good story for us. The neighborhood had extraordinary architecture, this sort of extraordinary sort of architecture that somehow, in a way, for me, embedded in it this sort of rich tradition of this area being, for me, bucolic. I mean, it uses a kind of neoclassical, you know, idea, but it's somehow this idea of the flora and fauna of the area is somehow bedded in that architecture. It's incredibly rich sort of pattern, and I sent my team out and we looked at all the kind of, we sort of really mapped the buildings to look at this idea of this architecture that was super dense, having a kind of a sort of Sullivan-esque, you know, light Sullivan-esque kind of patina. And of course, the neighborhoods became very famous for, you know, the sort of Harlem Renaissance that we know sort of really transformed not only America, but also the world, out of this kind of a sort of hot pot, sort of ghetto, created this extraordinary explosion of culture, and exhaling, and for me. This is the sort of project on its context. This is St. Nicholas Ave, and the site is here. There's a 20-foot grade change between this moment here and here. The site was really just this, and this was a kind of site for the city, where we basically negotiated to, our entrance should have been here, and we negotiated with the city to take a part of their land, which was here, and gave them a slot of land here so that we could make a plaza and enter the building here. So the building is slightly confused in the sense that the front elevation is here, but you can't enter that way. You enter through the blind sort of party wall, as it were. But what we gained by that was to make a kind of generous space that allowed the building to sit back and to create a plaza for the community. This is sort of an early sort of sketch of the project that was important, and really it's all about the section, this idea that sort of in the grade change, you have the housing, which then acknowledges the sort of the New York City's setback line, but sort of acknowledges it as a volume, not as a kind of a compromise, but as a kind of volume which sort of shifts, in a way registering the shift of the city and the change of the city as it went more vertical. The ground plane is a children's creche, which occupies this very privileged spot, absolutely in the light, with light wells, protected playgrounds and light wells. And then underground, we have a cultural center. This is a storytelling museum, which is developed with our clients. It was literally being developed as we were making the building, with parking and services, and then sort of a little small commercial sort of unit on the front. This is really looking at how that sort of plan works, where this is the sort of space that we gave to the city to allow them to park their vans and not to have it in front of our building here. And then we were able to take this space and create a sort of small plaza, which now has sort of food markets and is the kind of entry for, 3 different sort of uses. One, the creche, which is here, sort of with the windows out, the accommodation, which is in the center, and then the storytelling museum, which is on the end here. Sort of this is the storytelling museum in the sort of lower section, and then the housing up above, double-loaded corridor, and then sort of these sort of very simple, subtle things of sort of expanding, very gentle sort of bowing corridors, different units, and this sawtooth, which really came from really an observation that I showed you in the beginning, that sort of incredible housing, which I'll show you again, which had this stepped sawtooth section. And I sought to kind of use that building as a way to kind of work on this building, and in a way it kind of creates this relationship and this dialogue. This is the sort of grade change that I was talking about. So this is St. Nicholas Ave. This is the elevation that we came in, and this is the grade change where the commercial unit is here, parking is here, and the kindergarten or the creche is here, and then housing, community and offices for the building are here, and eventually these will be urban farms. We managed to get Amanda Burden to give us a zone change so that we can actually have urban farms on the roof of this building. So there's agriculture, sort of this sort of balcony view, and then the sort of program of this creche. In this building. This is then the sort of two-party wall ends. This is looking at that sort of elevation towards the east, looking at the light well courts on the back of the south, and then the front elevation. And a lot of people would say, well, there's hardly any windows in this building. And I was like, that's the blind wall. It's not the main elevation of the building, but it's really also, but in a way, it's the signature of the building and the profile of the building. Let me get back to the idea of the Sullivan sort of reference, and this is really the images of the analysis that we made of the area and this incredible sort of architecture in that neighborhood with this extraordinary language of flora and fauna, and wanting to engage that and not be frightened by this idea of this ornament, but to sort of understand that it deeply kind of coded in it this idea of maybe this place, and maybe that gave us a clue as to how we could also kind of make this building beyond just using brickwork. I wanted to see if I could go past using brickwork, so we looked at using a sort of fast process, a precast sort of large paneled sort of facade system, and became very fascinated by the roses that were growing in this area. There were rose gardens all over Manhattan, but also there were rose gardens in this area. And in a way, there's a kind of roost that I really loved, which was, I started to become very kind of infatuated with this Aretha Franklin song about the concrete and stone, the rose growing out of concrete, if you know that one, those of you in your age. So this is really a project about that song. So essentially, those roses were mapped by my studio, and we just changed the scales to kind of have them sort of have this sort of recessing and sort of kind of sort of foreground and background sort of relationship. And it's not a drawing; it is a vector. It's a negative vector, which is basically it's sort of a cut serrated with different indentations. And the indentations give you the sense of the rose pattern in the light, or rather in the sort of oblique of the light. So it's sort of you think it's a drawing, but it's actually these kind of it's a kind of digital drawing, which is just kind of about these kind of extraordinary indentations. This is the building in its context, now finished on this sort of important road. This is the building looking at that sort of first generation of sort of large buildings, and then in a way for me the second generation, not acknowledging the second form of these larger buildings, and now obviously towers. This is the building sort of, and the sort of large balcony for the community, which overlooks the tree line and overlooks the city with the offices and the community rooms. This is the inspiration for the facade. So you see the stepping system. And that's the building. So this form sort of creating this sort of relationship, but not literal idea, and a way for me to break what is essentially, for efficiency, a monolithic block, but one which then can be broken into an idea of the program of this area, which is terracing, but a sort of hyper terrace with an opportunity to always get a corner window for certain units which look down to the East River from every sort of level. And so in the light, you get this kind of moment where you have the sort of pattern sort of occurring, and you can imagine with that sort of budget, trying to just make grills disappear, not have boxes out was everything. You know, that was a big fight. And then just the way in which the light really changes. And because it's an indentation in that way, it's sort of amazing how it works with the light. It's sort of, when the sun is absolutely on it, it disappears. But when you have the inclined shadows, the pattern appears in the most extraordinary way. And it's even more vibrant in the rain. It becomes even more sort of clear. And that's been kind of a wonderful thing to discover. And that's really a close-up of that pattern. So this is really what it is, and this idea of the sort of detail. And then this is that sort of new plaza with the new sort of building on its context. And farmer's market that now kind of is right in front of this building, and the whole neighborhood comes to it to have produce. And then, you know, it's a sort of creche, the sort of drop-off every day for kids to sort of have a space away from the cars, protected. The creche, which we designed with these incredible classrooms, but are elevated so they can't be overlooked by adults, but they can look over the city safely and have lots of light. And we designed all the furniture. We went to Italy to look at the Reggio Emiliano sort of program of teaching sort of children, and the sort of idea of overlook and spaces, you know, making sort of little micro spaces for children to learn how to use the world that we inhabit. Potty training, very important. You know, courtyards for play that are protected and overlooked by staff. And then kind of another courtyard that is for the storytelling museum. The sort of children's courtyards are on the other side, and this is a courtyard for the museum on this side. The museum is entered here, and as you come down, you see this, what I call a light chimney, which basically brings light 40 feet down into the plan. And the idea is that even though you're deep down in the basement, I really have this whole thing about not wanting those spaces to feel like they're just subterranean, especially because there are children there. And this idea that, yes, you go down, you come into this space with sort of teaching sort of arenas and mural walls where an artist a year makes kind of storytelling work, which is up for about a year, and then children's stories are kind of made around it. Round the corner from that, you have these sort of children's windows. Around the corner from that, you have these classrooms that are just behind the main exhibition space. And then a sort of street, which is that light shaft, which is between the exhibition space and the teaching spaces where the light is brought in, and this is the street for the sort of the education spaces and the main exhibition spaces and little booths for kids to be in, and then a sort of stage in that main space, and then a kind of beautiful moment where you have a collection space where we worked with the Studio Museum in Harlem, who we're working with and making their building to bring a collection, parts of their collection permanently on sort of permanent loan for about a year to this museum to allow storytelling to happen around the collection. So it really has kind of evolved into an extraordinary sort of cultural asset for the community, and then up into the residential part of the buildings, into the spaces, and then into the units. The units are very simple with this kind of set of windows, and then the sort of bay window that overlooks the community, the river. And then, we have the whole thing from the sort of what we call the IKEA kit-out sort of moment right through to, the person that wants to be a designer and has made it into a complete sort of experiment for themselves. And we get all these images from the residents, which we love, and we've got them sort of cataloged. And, like a homeless person who finally has like this extraordinary kind of home, and he's an extraordinary, we forget that musicians, there's a jazz foundation, a foundation that looks after jazz artists, and a lot of artists who don't make it and who aren't stars, get sort of left as the new generation come, and they are a large part of the homeless kind of population, and this foundation makes sure that this community is housed and has dignity back again. And it's kind of amazing to have this community in this building and their relationship to the younger generation, and sort of the views from the apartments back to the city. The upper space balcony for the community, which overlooks the East River and the sort of upper Harlem, as it were. And then the sort of backspace, this is the government sort of space that we gave over. This is the building in its context, the light wells, the light shaft form, and then the sort of building in its place. And then the building on the street with the kindergarten, the sort of creche up above, and then the unit just there. So, and then last two. I wanted to tell you about the Studio Museum, which is an exciting project for us, our second big project in Manhattan. And it's to build the Studio Museum in Harlem, an extraordinary institution that was made to really deal with the injustice of the sort of community of color that were not really being absorbed into the main canon of museum collecting and exhibitions in the city. And the Studio Museum was kind of set up to essentially deal with this problem in the sort of just post-war. And its mission was to incubate artists of color and to allow them to have a kind of space to be able to work and to develop their art form, and then to kind of network them to the community of galleries and to try to advocate for them to bring them into collections. And, this is sort of 50, 60 years later. I mean, the extraordinary group of people have passed through here, from David Hammonds, Glenn Ligon, Chris O'Feely, Ndeke Crosby right now. All of these artists, Kehinde Wiley was part of that program. All these artists and much, much more have been through this program and benefited from the support of this program. The institution started in Harlem. This is just looking at those images of Harlem. And its kind of extraordinary spaces. This is the kind of, in a way, Harlem is one of those dense kind of communities, urban areas where really I say that the kind of the pattern of public life is articulated through, theaters, extraordinary kind of provision of public halls, churches and mosques, which are sort of in great number, informal and formal, and then of course the kind of relentless architecture of the sort of terraces which define the streets. There aren't really many parks, very, very few pocket parks, but it's really, the public life for me is sort of oscillated between the street life, which is about, car infrastructure, but then the stoops, which are inhabited by the community, very much as the kind of public space, and these institutions. And in a way, the building that we're developing for the Studio Museum is a reflection on that. The Studio Museum started as one of those sort of, this is the first picture when they first opened. These are the founding members of that kind of organization, and it was a shop that started it with the studios sort of up above. This is sort of looking at Harlem at that time. And this is the Studio Museum now. They then were given this bank building, which then was kind of changed and been retrofitted in sort of drip fashion. and never been good enough, really, and it's continually failed. And it's amazing the institution's reputation and the infrastructure kind of are completely mismatched. And so in a way, we're so kind of happy that they are finally going to get a worthy home. The building is on 125th, which is this big avenue here, and it's a through block to 124th. 124th is very much a residential street. This is the big commercial street of Harlem. The Apollo is just down here. And the building really is a kind of, for me, a meditation on those three things that I talked about. This idea of the spectacle of the theater, the sort of extraordinary soaring quality of the spiritual spaces, the churches and mosques, and the kind of relentless nature of the terrace and its kind of edicular profiling that creates this system. And in a way, the architecture is a kind of an agglomeration, a hybrid of that. This is the kind of cross-section of the new institution where on 125th, we create a reverse stoop where the entire foyer becomes a performance space for the street, so that this enclosure opens and that the entire foyer is really kind of becomes a space where anybody can actually watch a performance in the section. And then you can come into a sort of Juliet balcony sort of lobby where you then sort of invited up a very grand stair, a sort of almost, it's like 15-foot wide sort of a stair which in each section, which has these sort of Juliet moments, that is really the main sort of device to rise up into a series of galleries and spaces until you land on the roof and you get these fantastic views north and south. In the core of the sort of presentation to 125th, you have education with sort of this low window for children to look at the street, and then these new studios for the artists that are in residence that are registered very much in the facade, and then they sort of have a space where they meet sort of on the facade. This is really just to quickly take you through the plan. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but it's just basically this through block with a bar core which divides major spaces and minor spaces essentially, and then the circulation wraps around that. This is the final proposition that we're going to build. So this is the idea of the kind of performance entrance that can be, it has a kind of motorized curtain that can kind of enclose it, so it can be private, but it's always generally open, and it also acts as a gathering space for students, etc., a shop. Each sort of moment we got our variance from the city to be able to project over the sort of pavement line, because this is a cultural building and we wanted to be able to kind of offer what we're calling sort of modern ediculars, where art can be placed or programmed on sort of a lot of the surfaces of the spaces. The education space, the artist studio are sort of met in this third large window, which is a kind of meeting teaching room, where the sort of the heart of the building is really expressed in the center. So sort of exhibition spaces and upper terraces up above, and then entrance and foyer systems below. This is that moment where the sort of form dissolves and comes down. The building is made out of a terrazzo with a black marble ground into it and polished. So when it's inside the frame, it's polished, and the outside are sort of rough, sort of shot blasted sort of exteriors. And then the sort of forms kind of dissolve and then kind of creates the entry for you in. This is that moment from the street where you look down into this sort of timber-lined sort of chamber where you can have performance. When you come through the sort of monumental stair, which you're encouraged to use. So we actually tuck the elevators away around the corner. We're sort of reversing the thing where it's very easily accessible, but you're really encouraged to walk up and down. And this idea of a ladder to light that sort of goes up and down through the sort of knowledge, this structure of knowledge that you sort of rise up and down in and can wait. There are benches to sit at, and you can sort of wait on each point. And it's the idea that it becomes almost like a sort of stoop again, a sort of the architectural stoop of the neighborhood, but sort of extruded. And we're working with Fiasta Gates, who's going to reconstitute the old building into an extraordinary wall work. These are going to be fragments of the old building which will be bedded into this kind of ascension on the plan. And then on that stair, the kind of views you get back out to the street and the sort of auditorium. The gallery spaces that are off that, sometimes 16 feet, sometimes 30 feet or 28 feet, etc. Each one kind of dealing with different scales, different proportions to allow different sizes of work. And then the studios with north light that are open to allow the sort of studio program to kind of work sort of well. Education spaces with the low windows for sort of young kids to be able to look out of the city. and the roof, sort of the permanent collection galleries on the upper levels, and then the roof with this extraordinary sort of view, both north and south, which can also be covered for events, and as a sculpture landscape on the back. So this is the elevation on 124th Street. I think I press on this and there's a, I don't know if the video's in there. I think I have to move this. I think the video is not in there. Yep. Okay, there was a video, but I think it's not been lined up. Last, I'm going to talk about the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian, as you know, is the project was a competition in 2009 to build on the last remaining site on the Washington Mall. The project was to create the museum dedicated to the dedicated to this new institution, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And it really is at the end of a 200-year master plan that has seen a collection of buildings, both sort of turn of the century right through to the sort of late 20th century. I.M. Pei, Gordon Bunshaft's Hirshhorn, Air and Space by SOM. And in a way, the museum really finally acknowledges the presence of this important institution, which has been, there are 200 African-American museums around the country, from little houses, you know, in New Orleans, right through to the sort of largest one, which is in Detroit, Michigan, which is probably the most kind of grand, purpose-built National Museum of African American History and Culture, and sort of ranging from informality to formality, always trying to wrestle with the story and to try and deal with this project. And in a way, what's interesting for me about this project was that it, apart from dealing with the injustice of this community never being able to be represented on the nation's front mall, always being in a way in the background, never in the foreground, was that it's also a museum that is, in the end, about a collection of things that are really predominantly sort of cresting in the 20th century about imagery, media, and information. In the end, it's a storytelling museum. It's a museum that's trying to unpack a 400-year sort of kind of narrative, but a 200-year story from the proclamation of independence to now of this community. People always ask, how does a kind of British African, you know, boy kind of have that experience of this community? And I always say that, you know, this idea of kind of fictitious boundaries are not always as clear as you think. This is Nkrumah, the person who liberated the African continent, the first president of Ghana, and this is Martin Luther King, and they were dear friends. Adam Clayton Powell, Malcolm X in Ghana. These communities were interconnected and dialoguing. My father worked for this man. He was the first generation of diplomats who worked for this man. These stories and this community were the stories about the modernity and the kind of resistance of the entire black world. It was not just something about another country, and it was really the relationships are really much more interconnected and much more woven together than people would sometimes perceive. This idea of the narrative of the Storytelling Museum also is that essentially the institution's objects, some of them are incredibly important and powerful, but they're not in that traditional museum sense of rare objects. They're objects with the kind of provenance of emotional power, of the emotional power of history, sort of applied to them, whether they are shackles or the first voting slip of, a person of color being able to finally vote, and their grandmother, at this moment, the grandmother holding onto that slip and giving that to the museum. So the range of objects are extraordinary, but also, in a way, the museum, when it started, only had, I think, 3,000 or 4,000 objects, sort of through the extension of its relationship with the Smithsonian, and it now has well over 30,000 objects. And those objects have come from a kind of outreach to the community who have kept incredible things and brought them to the museum. So the museum is a kind of new way of sort of creating a relationship with community and making visible a community that was basically invisible through the kind of bringing in of them into the story directly. I also love to show this Du Bois sort of plan of the slave trade. This is a sort of map of the sort of slave trade over 400 years, and really the kind of, you get the sense of the power of the extraction, which really happened in West and Central Africa, and really predominantly went to South America, then the Caribbean, and in the end, 400,000 to America. So the entire sort of community of nearly 35 million African Americans are descended from that 400,000 that landed at the end of the slave trade, which is also something that people don't fully acknowledge and understand. And that entire community we know comes from this, and it's really, we know this because it was trade. We don't know the names of the slaves or their original names, but we know the numbers because it was trade, and trade was very valuable, so it was audited and absolutely empirical. So this information is very clear and not something to be contested. It's not conjecture. In this idea of making the museum, I felt that this idea of the story and unpacking what you think you know and what you don't know was very important. And it seemed like in making a narrative museum, which was not about making a palace or a building as a container or objects, I wanted to see if there's a way in which the very form of the building could speak directly to the story, so that immediately upon seeing the building, you are in the museum. So from the outside, you're already in the museum. The building is, it's not a project where you're sort of waiting to go into, but every day you pass it, you've actually visited the museum. And one of the thinking about, the sort of thought about that was to really see if one could make a fiction. And the fiction was, what would happen if the 400-year sort of slave trade did not happen? And what happened if architecture had just sort of developed without that, from that sort of incredible moment of abstraction in Africa, where the sort of arts of that period moved from figuration to extraordinary abstraction. So those of you who know your African art, sometimes it's referred to as primitive. I find that deeply offensive. This moment of the kind of transition from sort of figural work that you see in Benin, etc. If you're going to say anything was primitive, you can look at the work from Nigeria from 3,000 years ago, which is clay ceramic pieces for funerary objects, which are extraordinarily figurative. But in the 15th century, you get this kind of extraordinary abstraction, which is the beginning of a kind of transition when the continent is divided into about 6 empires. So, and under this, the Yoruba are probably the kind of high point craftsmen living in the forest, river delta, and they are the woodsmiths who create this abstraction, which then really, I think, for me, sort of really, it gets changed and mimicked throughout the different groups. So to sort of conceptualize it as kind of disparate tribes sitting alone is to really misunderstand that time. It was a series of empires communicating, but with a kind of a sort of West African empire that was really at the high point of its power, which was what we now call modern-day Nigeria. Something like this, which is a caryatid carved by master craftsmen, shrine craftsmen, who have sort of venerated sort of people who had a secret knowledge about this geometry and its meaning for creating narratives about kings, or sort of warnings about, you know, dangers, etc., or parables about stories. These people would carve these extraordinary caryatids for the inner sanctums of shrines. And the shrine would be the most holy sort of object, and anybody from that time would know about this. You wouldn't be able to visit it as a normal person, but you would know about it. And somehow it would be the most kind of venerated thing that you could have. In a way, it was the symbol of memorialization, of deity, of spirituality, of a kind of, you know, a completion. And so I wanted to somehow see if one could use this form, this idea of the narrative as a body, and really specifically then looked at this triple-headed corona, which is the kind of, as it were, almost capital column head of these forms. There's sometimes double, singles, or triple, or quadruple forms, depending on the story and what it's trying to do, as a motif that would be something that would be a kind of way in which to kind of engage with this architecture, and a way to maybe talk about the connection to Africa by just signifying this abstraction. And then, to not be literal about it, I wanted to also understand that this is a story about a hybridity which happens through slavery, and that slavery is predominantly about labor, and that this West African community, who are incredible metalsmithers and woodworkers, also build America and also build a lot of the kind of architecture as well as the kind of agriculture of America. And some of these are examples of houses that we know were built by slaves, and sort of learning how to kind of cast, learning from the kind of casting techniques that were brought from the north, from the factories, but were done by hand in these sort of southern kind of communities to try and get those kind of effects. And so this idea of labor and this history are sort of the primary sort of systems that I'm trying to kind of negotiate in this geometry of this form. And the site, so all the palaces of culture that I was showing before are built here. This has taken 200 years to do. And this is the last site, and this is L'Enfant's plan, where this is actually supposed to be 2 gatehouses at the end of the palaces to transition to the Washington Memorial Grounds. So in a way, this is a half site of one of these. And, in the beginning, it was seen to be a part of, it's not, I think it's a great site, but in real terms, it's not really a full site like one of these kind of sort of main kind of sites. But for me, it became that sort of idea of it being a sort of vertical system rather than a horizontal system allowed me to kind of see it as a panoptic moment to actually get an extraordinary overview. By being at that hub between the mall and the memorial grounds, it was able to register the history of America by going vertical. And so I kind of very early decided that there would be 9 windows that would kind of mark these forms as you moved around the building. So Congress, the mall, the National Archive, the White House, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, which was being built as we were building ours, and Jefferson, of course, Washington in the sort of center right next to the form. So this idea of a building within a building, a form that is kind of an ancient form, but also somehow but a totally different scale, a new scale, a sort of a new kind of architecture as though it somehow has existed. This idea of the triple nature of the museum, which Lonnie, the director, gave, which is history, the migration from the south to the cities, making your way, the middle system, and then the last part, culture and community. Sort of the triple nature of that also being expressed by this triple form as a register, this tripartite form of the building. On plan, this is Laurie's plan, which we had to study very, very carefully. Catherine Gustafson, who's the landscape designer, really worked with us to kind of make sure that we kept the natural paths from people from the Oval kind of coming across the site. And then really looking at Laurie's lines, tried to sort of make a reference to the Beaux-Arts lines that he'd sort of developed these incredible ellipses by taking kind of quarter ellipses, half ellipses that bring people round the building to the site, as it were, allowing you to bypass or to kind of enter and then continue onto the mall. So there are these twin systems that kind of intersect the site. And then really the site is a 5-acre park. 5-acre park, which is a sort of elevated mound, but underneath it is the entire infrastructure of the museum, because there are very specific height limitations in Washington, and we didn't want to have our plant up above either, so we wanted to use the roof to get light into the building. So everything is below ground, which is what you shouldn't do, because this is a backfill. The mall is a backfill. It's not real ground. There was a canal here to kind of take the stones for the Potomac to build the Capitol, and this is a kind of sort of backfilled land. So actually having to create all your back of house and infrastructure and storage was probably the worst thing you could ever do in a museum. So we had to build a double structure with this extraordinary large cavity, which is pumped, which is our sort of our security against this thing flooding. Flooding was very important. We've built the building so that the entrance, which is the only building on the mall which has level entrance, is at the 150 flood year line, and we deliberately wanted to do that so that if anything did happen with the groundwater swelling and the water coming through, that you would not have flooding in the building. It has happened before. So it kind of makes sense why these buildings are on these pediments that are elevated up. But we wanted the landscape to also kind of come in at that gradient. And then this is that sort of new mound level. And this really is the plinth of the entire plan. And in a way, the form that you see above ground as the pavilion is only 50% of the museum. So you're looking at the sort of geometry of the sort of 50% of the museum, and the other 50% is in the 5-acre site, absolutely to its very edges. On the south, we made a porch, a sort of canopied form, which is a new form that I added to the primary form, and worked with a body of water to create a microclimate, which I can talk about, which makes this sort of southern aspect a kind of very sort of generous and climate-friendly, sort of comfortable space before you get in. The plan of the ground floor is that that's the main hall of the building, 4 cores that deal with all the structure, so there are no columns. Everything is hung. Guy Nordstein and his team did an incredible job of creating a cage, which is my sort of corona form, which hangs from a structure which the 4 cores support. The 4 cores create a cross plan that I really wanted, so that you see the 4 lights. You see the south light, east, west, and north light very clearly, framing them, because the mall is absolutely on axis. It's like a compass, and I really wanted to register that. And then you then go down 40 feet to a lobby, and then down another 40 feet to the galleries, and then you rise up into the exhibition spaces, which are up above. Sort of going up to offices on a large plate up in the roof. This is the section, so you see this is the 80 feet sort of excavation down in the ground, and then this is the upper level above ground. And you can see the height line, that it matches the sort of height lines of Washington and the relationship to the monument right here. This is the cross section, so this is the south with its porch, and the north, which has its own entrance, and this is the history galleries, 80 feet down in the ground. This is the 40-foot level that brings you in. So, and then you go up from history, 1 pillar, into the community, sort of moving through America, and then culture and the arts finally on the end. The skin of the building, so this idea of labor and this geometry kind of fusing, really comes directly from looking at a panel that we found that we were led to believe was made by a sort of freed slave who was a metalsmith in Charleston who who worked on many houses. And I wanted to, I struggled with this for months, working through how to do this. And I basically, in the end, first I almost wanted to kind of just rebuild it, but also then at the same time that was not satisfactory, wanted to change it. So in the end, I kind of wanted to honor this without having too much authorship over it, but to use a system of portraiture, the way in which people draw portraits, to register the artistry of this handmade cast sort of iron work. So we sort of mapped the key geometries that kind of allow you to understand how the form, the canthus patterns curl and are made. Almost in the same way, if you do a drawing, you kind of measure the distance from the eyes to the nose to the forehead, and you do double, triple, and you get the key kind of guiding forms. That's really what you're looking at when you look at the building. It's really a drawing, a sort of homage of this original form, which is then made into a system which is then triangulated and then tessellated into this pattern. We just sort of almost like an ink blot folded it out. So this is one panel that the geometry drawing is, and folded it into 4, and it becomes one panel for the building. And then we kind of changed the densities from very solid, sort of 60% density, the sort of 30% density to 60% transparency. And each one of these is then used in a very specific way around the building. This is what I always say is the real elevation of the building. You think it's just a sort of metal ironwork that's put up as ornament. It's really a solar performing building, which is allowing the apertures to allow your eye to kind of focus on the windows, the 9 windows that kind of are marking those views that I talk about. Purple is the most dense, red is the most transparent, and red is where people are gathering, escalator rides, moments in the program, so that you're able to see through. And it's really a kind of this sort of environmental register. And these are the sort of very detailed study drawings we have to make to sort of show the effect of the different densities on the facade, which are sort of these very almost Beaux-Arts-like drawings that we had to make to sort of really show the sort of these kind of subtleties in the system. And this is a view of the building. I like this image in the winter where you really see it without the sort of when the landscape is resting, and you really see the kind of geometry of the forms and how it sort of ends that moment between the Federal Triangle and the relationship to Washington, the White House. And then just really in the spring, looking at how the building sort of appears in its context. Here it is next to sort of the monument. And from the White House, how it's from the sort of Lincoln's bedroom, it really has this kind of very powerful relationship. What what was wonderful was being able to finally get to understand how the White House works as a kind of system to understand this entire monumental landscape as a system of democracy, which is a really incredible idea, that somehow you can see the city performing from the main balconies of the White House, hearing children playing, hearing work, looking at the cultural institutions. And then from the mall, sort of ending that sort of moment of the sort of white stone sort of villas, and then this kind of moment which then blurs into the context. I always love this because it's sort of really the dark fellow in the context. It sort of balances it, I think. And then sort of view from Mr. Owens' kind of work. So this idea of this way in which the building kind of creates this kind of new sort of register of the end of the mall and the beginning of the memorial grounds. And how it is, for me, in the end, this solar pavilion. It's, in the end, this building which is registering the light. So this is looking at it from the south, and just looking at it from 15th Street. None of these pictures are doctored. They're just photographs taken at different times of the day, and different events. This is sort of in the evening when the sort of west sun is hitting the water and bouncing on the canopy and creating this extraordinary dapple. We sort of really worked to make that happen. We looked at the angles to try and really allow that to happen. And then just the way in which the porch makes also a relationship, tipping up to create a kind of relationship with the sort of upward form of the geometry of the building. And this is a real picture as well in the light, so in the south. So just looking at that kind of way in which it somehow looks as though it's alive and it's inflamed. We made sure that the casting of the material really insisted was not going to be a sheet, that it's a sand cast aluminium panel with a bronze coating. So it really almost literally honors that process from 200 years ago, but in our modern time. And then the way in which the water kind of creates these beautiful effects. The temperature in the outside sun between here and here can be as much as 7 to 8 degrees from the outside sun using evaporative cooling with this and this. So we kind of made this gap at the back. Architecturally, I wanted it, but also for me, this idea of the sort of stack effects happening here had a release at the back of the building, so that the building, this idea of the water climate happening, but also the kind of heat buildup is then allowed to kind of percolate up behind. And this is like one of the most popular spots when it's really hot, like today. You see thousands of people underneath the porch before making the brave run to the Washington Memorial grounds. I always say this is your last post before no return. And then when you enter the building, you really understand how the skin works, that what you think is opaque is actually flooded with light. It's a glazed building with the museum inside it, and these lenses, these windows that face these particular views are these apertures that come out to frame these views that I was talking about. And really, it's a sort of building within a building, and there's no sort of central atrium. The cavity in its different dimensions is the kind of way in which you understand and register the building. So these are some images from the lobby, just looking at the different effects of the lights that I really was talking about, this idea of the space in the center and the way in which it registers east-west light, and people find their own spots in it. And for me, that was really important, that this almost like a square, this room at the beginning is like a square that you can come into, and it's a free space that you can come into and just spend time in. And, you know, dramatic when the sort of, the colors change. Then you can get a ticket and go up, or you can go down as the kind of way we would like you to do it, which is to take the escalator down. There's a kind of monumental stair that I made, which is just a journey that takes you through this soft coil. We wanted to make a kind of an extraordinary staircase with no column. So this is kind of incredible 40-foot sort of staircase that spirals, sort of reveals itself, hides you, and then reveals you again. So as you come in. So as you're coming down, you disappear and reappear sort of in this sort of coil, almost like a Serra landscape, sort of reprogramming you for this new sort of space that you're coming to. And then this is the space into the sort of people waiting to go into the history galleries down below. And then in the history galleries, you come into a slow elevator. This is Applebaum's work to kind of create Ralph Applebaum's is the sort of work that was on the exhibit design with the curators, and we were the architects coordinating the kind of overall sort of way in which you kind of worked with the narrative. You go down into very compressed spaces. You start sort of 400 years as the slave trade starts, but really you move through, and this is the beginning of the exhibition where you come into the main hall, which is this sort of 75-foot sort of incredible chamber, and you start with Jefferson and the paradox of Jefferson with his slaves, but this person who writes this incredible document, which is the beginning of this incredible country. And what's amazing for me is that in this museum, which I think is something that was learned from understanding that one can't make experiences from this history just through sort of Madame Tussauds waxworks or through kind of dummies, that actually that is somehow to miss the power of those, and that everything in here is a real object, and when it's not, it's neutralized. It's not made literal, it's neutralized as a sort of, so it's very clear that it's just a representation and it's not in a way trying to kind of fool you. And everything that is real, that looks real, is real. That is a real train that we had to bring in before we sealed the building. It's one of the segregation Pullman trains that was given to the museum as we were building it. So it had to come in before the ceiling went in. And that was amazing that was done. This is the amount of cotton that a slave would pick in a day. This is the Louisiana Guard Tower. It's extraordinary in this place. The sort of engagement rings of slaves, the slave cabins. This is a real slave cabin that was brought from the South and reconstructed in the museum. So in a way, what is also predicated on this narrative is that somehow the provenance of the objects impacts you emotionally when you know that it's real. When you go in front of Emmett Till's coffin, which, we are not allowed to take photographs out of respect for the family, but if you go into that room, which is on this level, you are there with that coffin that this boy with his brutally mutilated face sort of was kind of in, and this, I always have a tear in my eye every time I'm in that room. It's just, you can't help but feel something with the provenance of these real objects. You rise 3 tiers in this history gallery, which takes you through the sort of the story in a way. It's a kind of summary story from independence, from the agrarian South, the migration to the cities, and then culture and now. And you're looking at different architectures. This is a slave's house. This is a free slave's kind of sort of beginnings of architecture, this sort of mud and timber architecture where clay or mud is rammed between the timber planks. The migration to the cities and the beginning of the civil rights movement and the sort of post-war era of America. And always history is not, you're not in a narrative where you can't go back, which is sometimes the way in which narrative museums work, and this is a conscious effort to counter that, so you're able to overlook the layers of history and to see people engaging with history, which is an important postmodern idea that we are now able to kind of think like that. We don't need to be in a didactic which is singular. That was something very powerful that I was really happy that the curatorial team and the museum sort of made happen. And then, everything from, this is a real Tuskegee training plane that is hung sort of at that end sequence, the sort of middle sequence, and then the sort of last sequence where you're looking at, this is a kind of incredible spot where you see the inauguration of Obama at this sort of moment, to sort of just kind of make a prelude. It's not an end, but it's a way to kind of make an end to this journey. At this moment, a lot of people are quite traumatized after that journey. It's a kind of deep, steep, thick piece of learning, and I wanted to basically have a kind of room where one would be able to have a kind of reflection with Lonnie Bunch, the director. We talked about this idea of having a material, an element that would define the community, and for me, immediately, water was it. Water is the material that the Middle Passage is all about. Water is the material of nurturing the land to make agriculture. Water is the material to use to make architecture and form, and in a way, I wanted to make a room that would be a sort of special respite that you would have to kind of discover, move through. It's sort of surrounded by the Zimbabwe stone, this kind of incredible African stone that you come around, and you go into a chamber which is a bronze room, and bronze from West Africa is very important. Bronze is the metal of the metalsmiths of West Africa, the sort of ancestors of this community. So you're in this bronze room, and then you have, it's a kind of 28-foot room with an oculux, which is on the north side, and there's this kind of incredible fountain of water, which is just gushing, and it's incredibly loud. And it's basically, in a way, also inspired by Martin Luther King's incredible words about being determined to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. So in a way, it's a kind of manifestation of this, all these issues coming together, sort of the past and the present. And it's also then sort of in this oculux of light, which is a register on the north, which I'll talk about in a second. And it becomes a space just to be silent after reflecting on this history before rising up into the building. This is that oculux on the north side, and you don't see the people down below because the section we developed it, so we wanted it to be so deep so that you couldn't peer down onto that sort of very quiet moment with people, but you would see water gushing around the perimeter and pouring down into the space. We found out that actually this site also was a slave market at some point, which was for me kind of eerie because in a way in this geometry, it's sort of, there's a kind of sense of almost a slave pedestal, but for me, this idea of lifting it in light and water, sort of liberating it from that sort of past was also part of the kind of narrative of what this form is trying to do as this place on this north side. So what you think you know and what actually is happening. And so this is that moment in the night where you see that water rushing in and it's illuminated. And then in the sort of space, there are auditorium spaces which play with the facade, kind of making another plaza inside the building, which is the sort of auditorium. There are cafeterias, which are very popular now because of the cuisine of the community. And then you rise up into the light. And you see, as you rise up, you suddenly realize that each return of the corona is basically clear light, and the three crystals come together to kind of create this amazing crystalline light. And as you rise, you get these incredible framed views into this very luminous space, almost like being under a tree with the sort of shadow play that's happening on the west. I made you kind of come along the west so that the west light is always playing with you as you rise up the building. And these are the lenses, some of the lenses on this side of the form. And when you're in it, these are those moments where I said we kind of thinned out the density of the form. So you can actually look through it. People can, your eyes are so good that you can actually see right through this form, and it looks luminous and light, and where you're not there, it kind of closes down. You go into the community galleries, looking at the first professional classes of the community from sort of being tied to the ground, the military, hospitals, etc. And always a window which peers to a view. This is the one that looks towards Congress. One that's looking towards Jefferson, these sort of windows. There's sport, looking at the kind of the sort of relationship to sport. This is Serena and Venus Williams, which I really like. The military, very important, and the sort of all the generals and soldiers of sort of decorated soldiers of the community, sort of framing the first General Washington's monument. So you have Colin Powell on this wall right through to sort of, Civil War sort of veterans of color. And this idea that somehow the architecture can also play with its external context is very important. This window had to be made at this angle so that we could be straight with the monument, because if we'd made a normal window, it would be at a diagonal. So this geometry is all about correcting the lens relationship to the monument. It's not a gesture just for its own sake. It is about the way in which one has to use computer technology. We modeled and mapped it to create this framing specifically. And then up above, culture, and the sort of way in which that explosion in the 20th century really affects not just America, but the world. We found this caryatid in a museum in Munich when I was having an exhibition there, and connected the museum to that institution, who have now got this on a long-term loan, which is amazing. So the object which inspired the building is now in the building, which is really wonderful. And it's just the kind of magic that happened around this project, which you can't sort of plan, but it was kind of beautiful. And so you get culture, and always the windows which frame. and in the topmost parts, the visual arts. And the visual arts are kind of going on, and the performing arts are always going on and being collected and go on. And from that moment, you're able to come out onto a balcony, which overlooks the entire thing right down to the 40-foot sort of lobby of the lower basement. And you get this fantastic long panoramic view over, this is the window to the White House, sorry. You get this fantastic view over the entire Washington Memorial Grounds. It's probably the most privileged view in DC, where you can see everything. You can see right through to Arlington, up to the hills. And it's this kind of massive sort of window which allows you're able to just come to and sit at, and it has a kind of Juliet moment above the lens to the monument where you can just spend time. And then it has education spaces, offices, and an amazing terrace if you're lucky to ever be invited to that upper terrace. It's one of the special terraces in DC, which has this view. Yeah. And then sort of looking at the sort of, this is the space for the library and also for the genealogy section. So you can see the layering. This is where we made it most transparent. So we have these moments where there's transparency and you can have this layering through the skin, the way in which light falls on the building in the evening. I mean, we have just photographed it endlessly as it teaches us so much. And then just the way in which the building changes in the different lights. It's sometimes incredibly bright, incredibly dark. It becomes ghostly and luminous at night. This was something you're not allowed to light up buildings in DC. So we wanted this building to light up, so we worked very hard to move all the emergency lights to the perimeter. And that's basically the emergency lighting system, which is always on, so the building is always luminous. And so that was how you got around that rule. And that's the building in its context. And also, obviously, this form is the same angle as Washington's pyramid. It's the same 17 degrees. And so in a way, the building seems like it's not part of the context, but it's also very much part of the context. And you see how it sort of plays with it as you move around it in the night and in the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, David. That was really moving, inspiring, and I'm thrilled to have you here tonight. If you will indulge me for just a moment, my name is Rebecca Johnson. I'm Executive Director of the Center for Architecture and Design in AIA Philadelphia. And tonight is one of our signature events of the year here at the center. And the Louis Kahn Award is a special time that we bring someone here to talk and inspire us. I mean, it's really part of the center's mission to really engage the public, talk about architecture, get people excited, and it's a long-time commitment of our chapter and our community to the Charter High School of Architecture and Design. So I thank you all for being here tonight. It is a really important event for us. We do exhibits, which I'll talk about in a minute, and we also do our Design Philadelphia Festival every year, as well as we had 600 events where we bring this community together at the center last year. So thank you again for being here. David's team, I want to thank some folks. Starting May 17th, there will be an exhibit, David's team. Specifically, I want to thank Louisa, Josh, Zoe, and Duncan for putting together an incredible exhibit from their firm's work. And this chair, thank you, Noel, very much. This is a chair designed by Adjaye, and this will be in our window. So from May 17th to August 16th, you can come by at the center and check out the exhibit for more content and more exciting stuff. I want to thank our sponsors again. I don't have the clicker. Do you have it? You got it, David. Thank you. I want to thank our sponsors, MIS Capital, Liberty Property Trust, Clemens Construction, Knoll, Powell Trackman, Aileen and Brian Roberts, Langan, LF Driscoll, and the Neubauer Family Foundation, as well as WHYY. Without your support, this event couldn't happen. But the event really couldn't happen without our committee chair, Bill McDowell. Bill, please stand up. Thank you so much. Please, thank you. Thank you so much, Bill. Bill, really, thank you. And also to my amazing, amazing staff, David Bender, who, keeps me in line, to the rest of my staff, to the 16 volunteers that were here tonight. I really appreciate all of your help and support. And of course, to Sir Adjaye, for making time in your very busy schedule to be with us tonight. We are honored and we are inspired by your work. And with that, I'd like to close out tonight's program and invite the chair of the Center for Architecture and Design, Rich Davies, to help present the award.
Well, it is my great privilege and pleasure to present to you on behalf of the Center for Architecture the 2018 Louis I. Kahn Memorial Award to honor your extraordinary work and the extraordinary thought and culturally and contextually sensitive creation of materials, form, and spaces that have, I'm sure, enriched the lives of people who encounter them. Again, it's a great honor for me to present this to you. Congratulations, Sir David.